Well, good morning, everyone. So good to be here. Looks like we've got a lot of our congregation that is out traveling. Hopefully they'll be able to either listen in live or tune in later to the recording. But we're so grateful if you're here and you're visiting with us. We hope that you've been made to feel welcome here, right at home, and we hope that you'll come back and see us at any opportunity that you have. This morning we're going to talk about how Jesus restores our sanity. There was a little girl named Indy, who was born this year in the UK with mitochondrial disease. Most children born with her condition have difficulty breathing. They suffer from problems with the brain, arrested development, and usually they die in early childhood. Indy's parents were fighting, of course, to keep her alive and to find whatever treatments they could to help their little girl. However, England's National Health Service determined it was not worth it to keep Indy on life support, in part because they deemed Indy to be in too much pain, but also financially it was not worth it for the government to continue paying for treatment when she would not live for very long anyway. So you have parents wanting to keep their child alive and the UK government wanting to let the child die. Well, the country of Italy found out what was happening, and Italy stepped in and said, we will pay for her treatment. They even granted Indy Italian citizenship and said, we will take her as our own, and we will treat her here in our hospital. And actually, doctors in a hospital in Rome were optimistic about Indy. Not necessarily that she would, live a super long life, but they were optimistic they could provide some alternative treatments that would give her some care through her early years. Yet somehow the UK courts overruled Italy's efforts to help. They would not allow Indy's parents to take her to be treated in Italy in order that she be removed from life support, and Indy passed from this life on Monday of this week. For court judges to stop parents from seeking treatments, even in other countries, for their own children is just insane. And it is one of the manifestations of the way that sin has driven our world mad. Sin has so warped our minds that we have largely become a world that prefers death to pain. Sin has convinced us that this life is all that we have, that there is no higher purpose or life beyond the grave. So if it's not a good and pain-free life, well, then it's just not worth living. We would rather people be euthanized than to live a hard life. We'd rather have abortions than to see mothers in pain or to see a child have to live in poverty. Sin has so warped our perspective that life just is not precious for its own sake anymore. Life is only precious to us if it is prosperous, if it is comfortable, if it is pain-free. The insanity of sin has so warped our world that in many cases our world prefers death to life. And I want to start this morning by talking about how sin drives us insane and using Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5 as an example here. In Mark chapter 5, let's read verses 1 through 5. Sounds like there's some sort of reverb going on with the mics. I don't know if it's because the lapel mic is on and the pulpit mic is on, but just a heads up there to AV. So we're in Mark chapter 5, and let's read verses 1 through 5 here. Jesus came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. And when he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains and gashing himself with stones. Look at what Satan has done to this man. He lives out in the cemetery, surrounded by death everywhere all the time. He runs around screaming like a madman all day long. Matthew's account says he was extremely violent, and he would actually attack people as they passed by that area. He hates himself so much, he cuts himself with sharp stones. And Luke's account says he was naked, and he had not worn clothes for a very long time. This man has been driven insane by the devil. These demons have so thoroughly taken over his mind, he no longer has his wits about him. He has completely lost his humanity. He's living like a crazed, wild animal because the image of God in him has been so distorted. And in fact, I want to show you a pattern in Scripture where one of the consequences of our sin is to lose our humanity and to live like animals. Nebuchadnezzar, when he was corrupted by his own pride, and he looks out and says, man, I'm just so awesome because of Babylon and all the great things that I've done, and God curses him in Daniel chapter 4, immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind. So there's the isolation, and he began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. In Psalm 73, when Asaph was filled with jealousy against wicked people, because it seemed like everything's going really well for the wicked, and he was filled with bitterness against God because it seemed like all the righteous people were suffering, well, he said this about that: when my heart was embittered and I was pierced within, then I was senseless and ignorant. I was like a beast before you. When Jeremiah condemned the people of Judah for their sin, he said they were well-fed, lusty horses, each one neighing after his neighbor's wife. When Peter warned about false teachers, he said in 2 Peter 2:12, these like unreasoning animals, born as creatures of instinct to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, will in the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed. See, to call humans animals is a way of describing a kind of moral insanity that comes from not walking in God's image. According to Genesis, human beings are fundamentally different than animals because we have the image of God within us. We're made in His likeness, which means we're supposed to live as reflections of His good character in the world. Now, animals, they don't have that responsibility. Now, let me give you an illustration here. Growing up, my dad and I had cats. We had several cats growing up. We loved our cats. But if a cat did something bad, like tear up our furniture with its claws, I do remember my dad yelling at the cat for that, but I never remember him saying, don't do that because you're dishonoring the Messerli name. He didn't say, don't do that, you're ruining our family's reputation. No. The cat was not made in my dad's image. That cat had no responsibility or expectation to reflect my dad's character in this world or to represent the Messerli name and reputation in our society, in our culture. But I did, because I had my dad's image stamped on me. And His likeness was within me. So if I were to ever start tearing up our furniture with my claws, well, then that would have been a much more serious conversation. This was the fundamental problem with the man in Mark chapter 5. He's a child of God. He's meant to be living in line with God's image and spreading God's good character in the world. But Satan has so warped his mind that he is now unrecognizable as one of God's children. He is just an animal at this point. And consider 4 ways that sin makes us morally insane animals. First of all, sin makes us irrational. Animals, yeah, sometimes they kind of do some smart things, but animals really aren't making decisions based on a series of logical premises that lead to conclusions. They are not great about looking out into the future and considering, okay, if I make this decision, well then it's going to lead to one of 2 consequences, either option A or option B, and I don't really like those options, so I prefer option C, so I think I'm going to make this decision. Animals aren't thinking through things like that. It's why Peter calls false teachers unreasoning animals. And in Psalm 73, he called himself a senseless and ignorant beast. Sin causes us to not think things through and reason things out, which is why many times sin makes us do things that are just really dumb and really detrimental to ourselves. Sin corrupts our minds. This man that Jesus encounters in Mark 5, he is terribly self-destructive. He is cutting himself with stones. He's running around without any clothes on, just completely exposed to the elements. I read about a city in Baltimore where residents reported the mysterious disappearance of 130 light poles. Well, turns out drug addicts were cutting them down, these 250-pound poles, and hauling them off to neighboring cities and selling them for scrap metal so that they could make money to support an addiction that is destroying their lives. I don't know if this man was on drugs or not, but there was a guy named Derek Mosley who decided it'd be a great idea to rob a gun store with a baseball bat. So naturally, the owner of the gun store, when he saw the baseball bat, pulled out a gun and just held Derek there until the cops came. It was completely irrational, completely self-destructive. And how many times, okay, and let me just say this, parts of my sermon this morning will sound like a diatribe against our culture, but I always ultimately want us to look inward and look at ourselves and turn that mirror around. Because how many times have we committed a sin only to look back and realize that made absolutely no sense at all? Because all it did was hurt me. It was completely irrational. It was completely self-destructive, and I did it anyway. I lied to my wife. I knew it was going to come back to me, bite me, but I did it anyway. I got myself in a position of being all alone with my girlfriend or my boyfriend late at night and knew it was going to be too tempting not to go too far. I did it anyway. I know alcohol is my weakness, but I lied to myself, said I was only going to take a couple sips, but I knew I was going to drink way more, and I did, and I got drunk, and to top it all off, I drove home, which was illegal and reckless and completely irrational. I could have killed somebody. Secondly, sin makes us impulsive. This is similar to the point about being irrational, but it's not just about not thinking things through. It's about a lack of self-control. Irrationality is the corruption of the mind. Impulsivity is the corruption of the will. When Peter warned about false teachers, he not only called them unreasoning animals, but he said they are born as creatures of instinct. It's the idea that we just act on our feelings and impulses in the moment. We're driven by pleasure and by self-gratification. This man in Mark 5, he has no control over his will. He's living completely on instinct with no thought to consequence whatsoever. Think about David when he was on that roof looking at Bathsheba. He's not thinking about anything other than the fact that he just wants her right now. Think of the Israelites who were just rescued from Egypt, and then the second things start to look like they're not going to have enough food, they impulsively start to accuse God of not caring about them. And how many times have we committed a sin? And then when we look back on it, we think, man, I don't even know what happened there. It's like I wasn't even myself. Paul describes this impulsive insanity in Romans chapter 7, where he talks about how sometimes I just do the very things that I hate. And I agree they're not right, but I just do them anyway. And then he says it's almost as if it's not me doing it. It's almost as if it's sin living within me. He's not, trying to get off the hook by the insanity plea, but he's just talking about the power that sin has to just make you so impulsive that you just end up doing things that you know are not right because of the heat of the moment. Maybe I lost my temper and impulsively disrespected my parents, and now I'm grounded for it. Or I impulsively disrespected my boss at work, or impulsively said yes to a marriage proposal because I was desperate for love, right? And yet I don't even know this person. Maybe I impulsively moved in with this person that I'm not married to just because, hey, I just want to save money on rent. Or maybe I impulsively jumped into a get-rich-quick scheme. Sin makes us so impulsive in so many different areas of our lives. Sin also makes us indifferent. Sin corrupts the heart by making us uncaring and unloving. Listen to the way David describes his enemies in Psalm 17, verses 10 through 12. He says, they have closed their unfeeling heart. With their mouth they speak proudly. They have now surrounded us in our steps. They set their eyes to cast us down to the ground. He's like a lion that is eager to tear, a young lion lurking in hiding places. Again, the wicked are described like wild beasts, like lions seeking to tear their prey. And notice he says their hearts are unfeeling. The New King James Version says fat hearts, but most translate it unfeeling, uncaring, without pity, or callous. A lion doesn't really care if you're having a bad day or not. A lion doesn't really care whether you're a good person or not. You're just dinner. That's it. This man in Mark 5 was not caring about anybody at all. He was completely indifferent. He would violently attack whoever came through without any regard or care that he might be hurting innocent people. He was living completely for himself with no care or concern for others. Think again about David. After he takes Bathsheba, and how indifferent he is toward the life of her husband, that he puts him out there on the front lines and leaves him to die. I think again about the UK courts. Those judges, they talked about, we care and we're really sympathetic toward Indy and all that. But it's a struggle for me to think that love was very deep when they wouldn't even let them seek treatment elsewhere. How many times have we committed a sin? When we look back on it, we realize that was just completely insensitive to the people around me and totally selfish. Maybe we climb another step up the corporate ladder, but we have to step all over one of our coworkers to do it. Or we have an emotional affair with someone we're not married to, convincing ourselves it's okay because, hey, we're just flirting, but there's no consideration to how much this would absolutely crush our spouse. Sin makes us indifferent. It also makes us ignorant. Sin corrupts our awareness of God's purpose for our lives. Again, in Psalm 73, Asaph, he said, look, when I was filled with bitterness and jealousy and all that, he's like, I was senseless and I was ignorant. I didn't understand your greater plan for this world and this life, God. And animals, when you think about it, they really are completely ignorant and unaware of God's higher purposes in this world. Animals don't sit around contemplating their place in the universe. They don't wonder what it all means and where we're going to go when we die and why we're here in the first place. Animals just exist. And the man in Mark 5, he's just existing. He's not really living. He's not looking upward to God, inward in self-reflection, backward in self-examination about the life that he's lived, or forward to the future. He's alive, but he's not really living. That's what sin does to us. It blinds us to our real purpose in life until we become a hollow shell of a human being. Happened to Paul. Remember when he was persecuting the church? And it's interesting that Luke, when he writes Acts to describe Saul's actions, he uses animalistic language to describe him. When he says in Acts 8 verse 3 that Saul was ravaging the church, that's a word in the Greek used for the tearing of somebody's body by a wild beast. And later in Acts chapter 9, it says that Saul was breathing out threats and murder against the disciples of Jesus, almost like he's this raging, snorting bull. But while he was doing that, he was completely ignorant of God's true purpose for him, which was to serve Jesus and not persecute Jesus. How many times have we committed a sin? And when we look back on it, we think that wasn't in line with God's purpose for me at all. In fact, I was living like my life had no ultimate meaning or purpose. Maybe we were spending all of our time playing video games, getting high, sleeping around with as many people as possible, working for the weekend. And while some of that may be fun, it left us terribly empty because deep down we know there's got to be more to life than this. We see all four of these characteristics in our world today constantly. The irrationality of sin, where we've gotten to the point where there is an official list of literally 74 different genders now, where people are attacking and shouting death to Jews here in the United States based on what's happening overseas in the Middle East, where people now are, in an effort to fight against racism, now turning the racism and openly and unashamedly being racist against white people, and everybody is fine with it. It can be done publicly and unashamedly. You see the impulsivity of sin, where we're open to almost any and every deviant sexual practice you want to commit because, hey, if it feels good, why not? And then we'll even put it online so other people can satisfy their impulsivity by watching it. We see the indifference of sin. We have people walking up to strangers. This used to happen more often, but I read an article saying it's kind of started to resurge a little bit in New York, where people would just walk up to strangers on the street and punch them in the face. It's called the knockout game. They would try to just knock you out. Talk about just absolute indifference to human life. And if they're not knocking you out, right, maybe they're assaulting you and they're stealing your stuff. You got judges letting criminals go now with slaps on the wrist, only for them to go out and literally just go kill other people. We have teachers so indifferent about the premature sexualization of kids that they assign them material so explicit they won't even let the parents read it out loud at school board meetings. We have parents allowing their kids to go to libraries and listen to stories by cross-dressers. We see the ignorance of sin, where people have no purpose beyond this life, and they believe our highest purpose is to be pain-free, unrestricted in our behavior, and financially successful, which only leaves us empty and depressed. Sin is driving us insane, sometimes literally so, in the sense that our culture has never been more plagued by mental illness. And interestingly, God from the very beginning has warned His people that insanity and disorientation and confusion and fear are consequences of sin. Deuteronomy 28 and 29, the Lord will smite you with madness and with blindness, and with bewilderment of heart. And you will grope at noon as the blind man gropes in darkness, and you will not prosper in your ways, but shall only be oppressed and robbed continually, with none to save you. He says in verse 65, among those nations you shall find no rest. There will be no resting place for the sole of your foot, but there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and despair of soul. This is a great description of the man in Mark chapter 5. But let's see how this story ends. Because Jesus restores our sanity. Look in Mark chapter 5 again, verse 6. I know I've thoroughly depressed everybody, but let's get to the positive things here. Sometimes you have to see the depth of sin before you can appreciate the beauty of the remedy. And in Mark chapter 5, verse 6, seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. Now pause for just a second, because if you can put some things together from chapter 4 and verse 35, they started this trip across the Sea of Galilee during the evening time, which means it is nighttime when they got here on the shore, and this naked man covered with blood and cuts and scars, screaming like a madman, is running straight at you. And you're with Jesus, you're one of the disciples, what are you doing? Okay, I'm going to get back in the water. I'm swimming across that sea faster than Michael Phelps, okay? It would have been absolutely terrifying. But Jesus wasn't terrified at all. In fact, this demon-possessed man was the one who was terrified of Jesus. So in verse 7, shouting with a loud voice, he said, what business do we have with each other? Jesus, Son of the Most High God, I implore you by God, do not torment me. For he had been saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And he was asking him, what is your name? And he said to him, my name is Legion, for we are many. Jesus, notice, he asks this man's name. He knows there's still a human being in there somewhere. There's still an image bearer of God with a name buried somewhere under the rubble of this insanity. But for now, this man is so lost, he can't even give his own name. The demon speaks up and gives his name. The man can't give his name. The demon says, yeah, we're Legion. That's a reference to a Roman military unit of 6,000 soldiers. There are thousands of demons in this man. And as the text continues, Jesus casts all the demons out of this man into 2,000 pigs, and the pigs run over a cliff and they drown in the sea. Now, pigs were unclean to the Jews, so this may have been a visible way for Jesus to show everyone that Satan turns us into insane, self-destructive, unclean animals, like these pigs. It was also a visible way to show that Jesus has come now to remove the unclean spirits from the land. He has come to restore the sanity that Satan has stolen from people for so long. Zechariah prophesies about this. It will come about on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered, and I will also remove the prophets and the unclean spirit from the land. Now, this verse mentions idolatry, and interestingly, these pigs had become like idols in this Gentile area. Number one, because they would have likely used these pigs in worship to their false pagan gods. But number two, they're, in this text, treating these pigs like idols in the sense that they're angry at Jesus for costing them all this money. They care far more about their money than about the good that Jesus does for this demoniac. And so in verses 15 to 17, they came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion. And they became frightened. And those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and about all the swine. And they began to implore him to leave their region. What we find is that this man was not the only one driven insane by sin. The townspeople are now the ones acting irrationally and impulsively and indifferently and ignorantly now. They have just seen an incredible miracle, an incredible act of good, but they want Jesus to leave because they think he's trouble. Rocking the boat, don't know what this man's capable of. Anybody powerful enough to drive this, to heal this demon-possessed man? Like, who knows what kind of power this is? You cost us too much money. We don't want you around. But notice what Jesus did for the insane man. He saved him from his irrationality because we see him sitting there in his right mind. He saved him from his impulsivity. He's sitting down. He's calm. He's self-controlled now. He saved him from his indifference. He's not hurting. He's not violently attacking anybody else anymore. He saved him from his ignorance and gave him a new purpose in life. And we read about that purpose. Look in verses 18 to 20 how this ends. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him, but he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. Jesus restored this man's sanity. And he will do the same for us. But it's going to require two things. First of all, we're going to have to admit that our sin is making us insane. It is ironic because the opening verses say that no one was able to bind him. He had superhuman strength and no one could capture him. That's really how sin makes us feel sometimes, like we're invincible, like no one can touch us because we're so successful and great and everything's going so well. But what we don't realize is that our sinful pursuits, they come at a cost and they drive us slowly into madness. We may feel all alone and isolated, like we're living out in the tombs. We may be screaming on the inside with frustration and hopelessness. Maybe we even hate ourselves because we know that we're hurting people around us, or because we're not really living, we're just existing, and we become this hollow shell of a human living more like an animal on instinct than a child of God. We may be successful in an earthly sense, but inside we feel the insanity of trying to live without God, and it nags at us constantly. And the second thing we've got to do is run to Jesus. It's amazing how many attempts we make in our culture to restore our own sanity. Self-help books, positive affirmations, meditations, retreats, workshops, counseling sessions. And we may find some help there, yes, but it's only when we run toward Jesus, we fall at His feet and recognize His greatness, and He's the one with the power to restore our sanity, that we'll find true restoration. It has always been this way. We started with Nebuchadnezzar in the beginning. Well, notice how that ends in Daniel chapter 4, verse 34. But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored Him who lives forever. Asaph, the psalmist, he was filled with all this bitterness, but he says, when I pondered to understand this, it was troublesome in my sight until I came into the sanctuary of God, and he gained all of this clarity again because he's looking to God for the answers. I think again about Saul, just like a madman, just ravaging the church, acting like a wild beast until what? Jesus confronts him on the road to Damascus. He's got a vision, a divine encounter with Jesus, and his reason is restored to him. His sanity is restored. Think about it. Jesus, He restores our rationality by renewing our minds. There's so many verses about the renewal of our minds as Christians. Jesus restores our self-control by filling us with His Holy Spirit, who gives us the power over our fleshly impulses so that we are no longer slaves to our bodies, but we make our bodies our slaves by the power of Jesus' Spirit. Jesus restores our hearts, changes our indifference altogether, fills us with love for God, love for our neighbor. And Jesus restores God's image in us so that we can live with purpose in this world. The question is, are you willing to admit the insanity of your own sin and run to Jesus this morning? Maybe that's scary for you because the way that you've been living, you have felt so out of control for so long, and you just feel like, this is too much. I don't know if Jesus can handle this. Jesus is not scared. You might be terrified. Jesus is not terrified of what you're dealing with. He will restore any problem that you're having, any insanity on any level in your life. Jesus has the power to restore. Or maybe you're like the townspeople and you're kind of afraid, if I go to Jesus, I don't know what He's going to cost me. It might be difficult. He might make things uncomfortable and rock the boat in my life. I'm not sure if I'm ready. Jesus says, okay, nothing can be worse than what you're going through right now as you're stuck and enchained by the insanity of sin. Jesus says, you just come to me. Let me set you free. Let me clothe you and put you again in your right mind. He can do that this morning if you'll come to Him in faith, if you'll come to Him in repentance, if you'll come to Him willing to confess Him as your Lord and to be baptized in water for the forgiveness of your sins. You can come up out of that water with your sins forgiven and your sanity restored. We're here to help you in whatever way we can. Let us know how while we stand.